And welcome to the Holy Rose Podcast. We are so glad you're here. I'm Rob.
And I'm Rachel.
And we have a very special guest today with us. This is Dr. Jemar Tisby.
Glad to be here to worship with you. That's a little inside joke from the first take that we had. Yes.
You get a couple of pastors together, who knows what happens,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Let's start praying or something. I don't know.
That's awesome. And we're so glad and honored and privileged that you would take time out of this very busy season for you to engage in this conversation with us.
It is a busy season. We call it at Simmons College of Kentucky, where I teach, Black History Season.
Okay.
Not Black History Month. And so this is coming mainly from our college president, Reverend Dr. Kevin W. Cosby, who basically says Black History Season is from MLK Day in January up through Black History Month, of course, but extending throughout March and ending with MLK's assassination on April 4th is what he says. We need to take this whole quarter to examine Black history. So, and you say busy season, you're absolutely right. It's sort of like the way I say it, it's like the Easter season is to pastors. Yeah. This is to historians of race.
Yeah. So thanks for that introduction for us as well. So tell, if people are unfamiliar with you, who you are, where you teach, and what you published along the way, and what you're working on now.
Yeah, Dr. Jemar Tisby. I am an author. My first book is The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity and Racism. So, wonderful dinner table conversation.
That's right
there.
It needs to be, yeah.
It needs to permeate a lot of our conversations. And then the next book, that book kind of outlines the problem of how we got to saying 11 o'clock a.m. is the most segregated hour in America, right? And it's a historical survey showing all the ways that Christians, mostly white Christians, kind of failed when it came to racial justice. And then you get to the end of that book and you're sort of left like, okay, I see the problem. How can I be part of the solution? What do we do now? Which is always the most frequent question I get is, what do we do? How can we fight racism? So that became my second book, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Racial Justice. What that book does is lay out a framework I call the Arc of Racial Justice, which stands for awareness, relationships, commitment, arc. And I think just like legs of a stool, you need all three to have this firm foundation to build your racial justice efforts. And then there's a young reader's version of that for ages 8 years and up, I'd say through high school. And then my latest book is coming out in September of this year, and it's called The Spirit of Justice, Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. And it's designed another historical survey, this time looking at the people who, instead of compromising with racism, courageously confronted it. And it helps us who are on this journey continue to move forward, because it can be so deflating and exhausting. So hopefully that will encourage the saints and more.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. Yeah.
You also teach at Simmons College of Kentucky.
I do a couple other things. I'm a professor of history at Simmons College of Kentucky, which is a historically Black college, faith-based, which not all HBCUs are, and founded in 1879. So in order to be an HBCU, you must have two qualifications. Number one, you must have a historic mission to serve Black students. And then number two, you must have been founded before 1964. And so we actually didn't officially gain HBCU status through the Department of Education until 2015, because you also have to be officially accredited. And so Simmons is a bit of a comeback story. Founded in 1879, it's been through ups and downs. One of the biggest downs was during the Depression, where we actually lost our property. But through the help of St. Stephen Church in Louisville, they were able to buy back that original property that they had lost back in the 1930s. So only story we know of an HBCU regaining their original property after such a long period of time. And then other stuff I do, I speak nationally. I'm the founder and president emeritus of the Witness, a Black Christian collective dedicated to Black uplift through a Christian lens. And, husband, father, all the good stuff.
All the good stuff, yeah.
Wow. That's awesome.
Amazing. You're a busy man.
A little bit.
That's so good. Last year, I'm a part of this panel of sorts, really more so for me, a listening called Empower West Louisville.
Yes.
And last year we engaged in a conversation around your book. And so a lot of our folks around here studied it, and we did small group studies, and then we all came together at Crescent Hill Baptist Church, which is a Baptist church here in Louisville. And it was just, for my congregation itself, such a beautiful, hard, difficult conversation that I so appreciated the leader guide and the videos that came with it as well.
Good.
And it was just helped us, from all of our youth to adults, all studied the book and came together around it. And it was really, really good.
Wow, youth, like back, like high school, college?
That middle school and high school also studied the book.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
And really, I would say in a lot of our conversations, they had better conversations than we did as older adults, you know?
Yep.
And so, but my question around that, and I would say, hey, my congregation's question is, what inspired you on that journey to both write that book and to become a historian of sorts around racism within the American church? What inspired that?
Anger,
Sure.
righteous anger, and a discontent. So I had to remember that I had always had an interest in history. It was one of my subfields in college, but I hadn't delved into it formally for years.
Yeah.
It started becoming a much bigger part of my life when I moved down to the Mississippi Delta region in Arkansas, the Delta region of Arkansas. And I got down there through Teach for America, which is a 2-year teaching program. It's wonderful. They take these fresh, idealistic college grads and all that energy, and they give you like a 5-week teacher boot camp because none of us majored in education. And then they toss you into the most difficult schools in the country, and good luck, right? But it really was transformative for me and for a lot of other people who participated in the program. And you get to go someplace you probably never would, which for me was the Delta. I was born and raised in the Midwest and never thought I'd be down there. Ended up in Phillips County, Arkansas, which is the 4th poorest county in the United States.
Wow.
And that is directly a result of sharecropping, and then before that, race-based chattel slavery. So the Delta is cotton country. A lot of people don't know about the Delta or haven't been there, but it's basically that swath on both sides of the Mississippi River from Memphis down to New Orleans. Very poor. Population is mainly Black, so this is the highest concentration of Black people in both Arkansas and Mississippi. And it's also the poorest region of both of those states, which again, direct result of that history. So this history now starts to come alive in a way, because all of the issues of racial injustice, particularly the racial wealth gap, are now walking into my classroom on 2 legs every day. So you know, underemployment and unemployment, disinvestment in education, lack of housing and opportunities like that, all of that's real now. So now I'm starting to see the relevance of history. But I'm a serious Christian, so you go to seminary. And that's what I went to Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. And as I graduated, I had begun at that point, this is around 2015, to really see racism in the church, experience it. And so it was pretty clear to me by that point I wasn't going to do what I thought I was going to do, which was end up pastoring a church in this predominantly white Presbyterian denomination. So I was like, well, what do I do now? And my wife was like, get your PhD. I'm like, are you sure? Because I was just in school for 5 years getting this master's. You ready for that again? And so I applied to the University of Mississippi, and it's in the midst of that coursework as your first 2 years. You're just absorbing, just reading dozens and dozens of books. Whenever Christians would come up, they were usually on the wrong side of racial justice. And that was infuriating. But then even more, I say we have what I call an impressionistic view of the past. In other words, we have impressions about the past. We have impressions there was racism and lynching, and we have impressions about the civil rights movement. There's Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and the speech. But when you get down to the details, we don't know that many details, unless you've intentionally undertaken a study. But broadly speaking, right, that was my case for sure. But then I go into these classes and I'm reading these books and I'm hearing the names, the dates, the places, the torture that happened. And it builds in me what Martin Luther King Jr. called the fierce urgency of now. If things have been this bad, and we're certainly living in the legacy of them, then the problem is we're not doing enough. And so that is what started to birth this idea of the color of compromise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
I remember studying through that book of yours and watching the videos, and it became an intense conversation with my congregants, especially my older white congregants, about it. And it opened up this reality that I'm not sure they ever really took seriously. And that became, and then to hear you speak about it in person, they came back, and I told this story on a previous episode, and it's connected, about how a woman came up after one of our sessions, and she was mad. And I was like, oh, here we go. Like, what is she going to say, and how is she going to say it? And I get it probably in my own like little pastor voice, and I'm ready, okay, I know something's about to happen. And she goes, I'm mad. And I can tell this, and why are you so angry? Where are these feelings coming from? Why are we just now talking about it?
Wow.
And that became a framework. This has been about a year now of why we have these conversations within the church, because we need to be, right? So I wonder, for you, as you delved into the history of racial justice, particularly with Christian roots a part of there, and where we found ourselves in the state of complicity over and over again, can you highlight some key historical trends that you find particularly important for our audience to hear?
So, meaning, some like key historical points or events kind of a thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So, first of all, this goes way back. It's not as if there's some period in our nation's history where things were great for Black people, other people of color, which is to say, these notions of racism and white supremacy have been around since before there was something called the United States. In particular, we're going back to things like the doctrine of discovery, which is written about in a book called Unsettling Truths by Mark Charles and Soong Chan Ra. And this is a papal bull, an edict from the Pope in the 15th century that basically says, go forth, any pagan lands you encounter, God is with you, and God blesses you to conquer them and to convert the people there, or kill them if you have to.
Yeah.
So that gives this sort of divine imprimatur on European explorers. But as we pull back the layers, we got to ask why they're exploring. And it's not just for like Star Trek, to go forth and seek new life and new civilizations, right? It's for money. They're going to these different lands to strip them of their natural resources and sell them for a profit. And that is really the key around racism and white supremacy. So the ideology of, hatred because of someone's skin color, ethnicity, culture, that sort of follows behind the profit motive.
Yeah.
So the reason why you need to enslave people feel the need to enslave people, is because they want to maximize profit and minimize loss. And so that's what's happening in U.S. history. So in 1667, there's the Virginia Assembly, which is white Episcopal men, Christians, who pass a law that say slavery will not emancipate an enslaved Native American, person of African descent, or mixed race descent. Why did they need to pass that law? There was a dispute between Christian missionaries and plantation owners that said, well, if you proselytize and start preaching the gospel to all these enslaved people and they become Christian, they're now our brothers and sisters in Christ. And we're not supposed to enslave them by European custom, right? By English common law. So what do we do about that? So basically the missionaries said, well, we need to get their souls saved. And the plantation owner said, as long as you stop there.
Yeah.
So you can preach, you can baptize, you can have them go to church, but that will not free them. They'll still be our slaves, and not just slaves, they'll be our property. And that was what's really unique about U.S. race-based chattel slavery, is not only that it was based on skin color, but that it transformed people into property. So they were not considered human, legally speaking, and even spiritually for a lot of people. So that's just, there tracing it from there. But those themes of, money and profit motive, along with this sort of divine permission to do these things, is really what sets the trajectory for the U.S. and Christianity.
Yeah. Gosh, what do you think the modern equivalent is that right now, today?
So I think about this a lot. What is the bitter fruit of race-based chattel slavery as we would see it today? It takes a lot of manifestations. One that I think is pretty direct is mass incarceration.
Sure.
So the Equal Justice Initiative, led by Brian Stevenson, does a great job at the Legacy Museum to trace this direct line historically from race-based chattel slavery all the way up to modern day mass incarceration. The reason why I mention that is there's really no other sector of society that has such direct physical control of Black bodies, which was a hallmark of race-based chattel slavery. They literally physically controlled you, where you could go, what you could do, torture for punishment, chains, shackles, all that. The closest approximation we have to that now is modern day incarceration.
Yeah.
And I've taught in prisons for several years. And what really is soul killing, even as an outsider, is to go into these prisons, grown men, robust, strapping men. I've only taught in male prisons. And their shoulders are kind of bowed. Their heads are kind of lowered among the authorities there, right? Because they know any perceived infraction, they could go to solitary, they could face some sort of punishment or recrimination, right? But then at the same time, there's this bravado and this machismo that you have to have among your fellow, incarcerated people. But to see the fact that they just know they're controlled and they control their behavior based on that, it's just like a diminishing of the human spirit. And I can only imagine that's what slavery must have been like for so many.
Diminishing of the human spirit. Yeah. That was how you articulated that of the process of incarceration is dehumanizing in and of itself. I was doing a hospital visit a couple weeks ago, and I went down to Norton downtown, and it was I've done a few classes and ministries with incarcerated, usually female, and for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before, and I was checking in at the info desk, and the elevator dinged and opened, and out came someone incarcerated. I mean, wearing the orange jacket and had his hands handcuffed, and there was a police officer in front and behind. They were transporting him back after he'd received health care. But I had never seen somebody with shackles on their feet. And the sound that made. He also happened to be a person of color. He's a Black man, about our age, right? And that sound that made, like, is not okay. You know what I mean? It was just that it would stick with me of, like, this man needed medical care. And he went to the hospital and got it. But I had so many questions, right? And just reminded me of just, like, that process of incarceration in and of itself.
Yes.
Of taking outside, of being locked up, whether it's solitary. That process in and of itself is traumatizing. Yes. And we're taking people who, yes, have broken some laws, who maybe have made mistakes, but there's always a why, And what do we do with hurt, traumatized, people? We make it that much worse. We re-traumatize them.
Exactly.
And we wonder why we have trouble with reentry, or we have trouble with, So I didn't kind of go off on that tangent, but the way that you articulated the diminishing of the human spirit, like I could see it in that man's eyes because I looked in his eyes, And it was that will stick with me. That's haunted me in the best of ways. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
We can't ignore. It cannot be out of sight, out of mind when it comes to mass incarceration.
And it goes all the way back to the 13th Amendment, which is one of the Reconstruction amendments, and it's the exact amendment, a constitutional amendment it took to legally abolish slavery. Right? It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation that was limited. So it took this constitutional amendment, but there's the exception clause in there. So it says you can't, enslave a person or hold them in bondage unless they've been duly convicted of a crime. which is the loophole.
There's your free labor loophole. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Lease to convict leasing and even today labor exploitation within prisons. So yeah, I think that's one of the direct results of it, along with a constellation of others. But as we look at that again, that physical control and those literal physical chains, man, they're still around.
Yes, absolutely. The Ava DuVernay, the 13th documentary on Netflix.
Go out and watch it if you haven't.
Oh my word, it is phenomenal in the worst and best of ways, but tracing that from the 13th Amendment on to mass incarceration and the war on drugs and stuff like that is just, this is well done.
Dr. Tisby, based on your research, and I wonder if you can help us with this, what challenges it doesn't even need to be research at this point. What challenges do you feel like religious faith communities, and I would say particularly churches in the South, what do you think their challenges are when it comes to engaging in conversations like this one? How has that been seen, and how has that been overridden or engaged with? What comes to your mind there?
There are a couple of things that come to mind. One, another resource recommendation. So go out and watch 13th. And then if you don't already, have this book in your church library and your pastor study, Divided by Faith, by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. Sociologists really, I think, help us understand what some of the social impediments are, particularly for white Christians to really healthily engage in dialogue about racism. One of the points that they bring up is the individualism that pervades white evangelical notions of theology, and how that influences their views on race and racism. So if I could get all the white Christians in the U.S. in a room and tell them one message about racism, is that racism is more than about your individual attitudes or interpersonal relationships. Racism has to do with systems and structures that create and perpetuate inequality. So that it tends to be difficult for a lot of white Christians to understand, because they understand racism as this attitudinal thing and this relational thing, which is how they tend to understand their religion, is how I feel about
fascinating correlation there.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what they're bringing out, this white evangelical toolkit. They talk about this, just me and my Bible and my personal relationship with God, right? There's this hesitance in some areas, particularly race, to understand the communal and social implications of the gospel. So that then makes it very difficult to understand why people are making such a big deal in the 21st century about racism, right? I don't hate black people. Some of my best friends are black, right? I don't harbor any animosity. I have great relationships with people of color. So I don't have a racist bone in my body, is the phrase, right? And that may be true, but all of your sort of goodwill and heart-to-heart conversations at Starbucks or whatever doesn't do anything about the fact that black mothers die in maternity-related deaths at 3 times the rate of white women. Doesn't do anything about the fact that the median white family has 10 times the wealth of the median black family. Doesn't do anything about the fact that black people are disproportionately incarcerated, though we're only 13% of the population. We're more than 40% of incarcerated people, right? So those structural things that don't require, individual animus to continue to persist, that's what I find that a lot of white Christians struggle with.
Yeah, absolutely. That communal aspect, because it's like, if we can check, it's all about our personal devotion time and my personal sin, and check, I've been forgiven, and I'm good, and I went to church this morning, but sort of that critical aspect piece of and maybe it's kind of the American culture we run up against too, of this individual, I can pick myself up by my own bootstraps. And that's a kind of a broader scope there. But, I sense that sometimes in my own preaching and teaching, of trying to draw them outside of themselves. If the root of all sin is sort of that pride, that ego, of then being redeemed, it's kind of drawing you outside of yourself to love and care for other people.
Absolutely.
And we've lost so much of that communal aspect.
And part of why the black church tradition is a little bit more intuitive for us to think that way is because we always get treated not as an individual, but as part of a class or a group, right? So analogy I always use when I was in seminary, if I did poorly on a test, it wasn't just, oh, Jemar didn't do well on the test. It's Black people can't really cut it here.
Yeah.
You know, and whereas my white counterparts, you know, if Johnny did poorly on the test, well, that's just Johnny. He had a late night, whatever, right? It's not, oh, white people aren't, you know, really ready for seminary.
They
right?
get to represent themselves, whereas you carry with you,
For better or worse, you know, sometimes that's an unfair burden, but also it helps you think about justice in a different way, because it's not just for me, it's for we. And I find that is there needs to be an intentionality on the part of a lot of white people to get there.
Yeah.
And how sad is it that as white Christians, like that Christian, like being a part of the body of Christ, you know, you should think we before me. And yet, oh man.
Yeah, we could apply that to so many issues right now I mean, we're talking about race-based chattel slavery and how baptism wouldn't emancipate a fellow Christian, right? And the idea is that within the household of God, you have certain responsibilities and obligations toward one another because you're not united by the Holy Spirit. Well, what if we think about, you know, people trying to get into the country who are Christians, about people who are being bombed using U.S. funding and they're Christians, about, you know, people who are homeless or houseless and they're Christian. And yet, you know, even in the present day, should we last that long, you know, 40, 50, 60 years from now, Christians in the future might be saying, how can Christians treat other Christians that way?
Yes. How did that happen? How was that allowed to happen? I think a lot of, in our American context, especially, you know, for white people, I'm afraid that we're formed more by our political ideology.
Absolutely.
And whatever news station we listen to that's on how many hours a day, I can't even imagine, than they are about coming and hearing someone, you know, me teach for an hour or to do a Bible study. Yeah, that's great. Sure. But, you know, you think about the media that you're consuming, the words that you're consuming, I think much more formed in our worldview. And sometimes I think there's a stronger allegiance to whatever that political ideology is.
That's right. That's
more
right.
so than Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And I just got done interviewing Michael Ware, who wrote a new book called The Spirit in Our Politics. And he is a former Obama staffer. He worked in the Office of like Faith-Based and Community Partnerships. Is a devout Christian. What he's arguing in this book is exactly what you're saying. So many of us on the left and the right derive our identity from our politics and the brand, whether Democrat or Republican.
Party,
yeah. And what he's saying is like, that is, first of all, so far disordered, right? It's an idolatry. And it's so far downstream of what people of faith should start with, which is your own sort of character. Yeah. And so the subtitle of that book is Spiritual Formation and the Renovation of Our Public Life. So what he's arguing is we need to become the kind of people who care about the poor, the prisoner, the immigrant, right? But we're actually malformed spiritually because we actually don't have, in many cases, a robust enough idea of what it means to be Christian.
Yeah.
It really comes from a very shallow understanding of Christianity to say that I can very closely identify with any political party and that sort of defines me. He's also making the case that we misunderstand politics, right? Like, it's not supposed to be an all of life, this is my identity thing.
Yes.
That we say, because you should be able to say, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, and not have the assumption placed on you that you completely identify with everything that party does.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Correct.
So that's part of the disordering too. But I just love what he's saying about who we are and what we bring to politics before it's even about politics itself.
Yeah, that spiritual formation piece first of like becoming more like, I don't know, maybe Jesus,
You know,
becoming more like that person.
that sounds like a good concept for Christians. But you know, there's an irony there, right? Because I just said like the issue is too much individualism in a lot of Christianity, which is this inward turn. But even in that inward turn, we're not focusing on the right things, like that healthy character formation.
Right.
We're still being malformed, even as very individualistically minded folks, we still aren't doing those habits and practices, whether prayer or one of the things he says in the book that I love is just silence and solitude.
Yes.
Ooh, that would be very uncomfortable for some of us, but very healthy for all of us. So anyway, it's always, that's what racism does. It has these embedded contradictions and illogical inconsistencies, whether judging someone based on their skin color, the amount of melanin in your skin, or let's be hyper individualistic, but actually let's not turn a critical eye toward ourselves and our own spiritual formation.
Yeah.
Wow.
What do you think that the root of that is? What would you call the root of that, kind of that turning inward individualism, but also the struggle with the words of Christ that people hear every Sunday morning, that turns them outward, but then they come back to the me and Jesus moment? Fear? Is it security or identity? How would you say what that root would be?
It's a probing question, and I think it probably has a lot of different answers. Sure. Speaking historically, I think money has a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
I mean, we are the wealthiest country in the world, and as much as the Bible talks about money, I feel like that has an influence on our spirituality in the way we do church and the way we understand Christianity. So we've morphed Christianity in this wealthy nation into another cause of comfort, to be part of the group, to identify as Christian has been up till recent times more of an advantage than a disadvantage. It gives you a sort of group identity, right? You're in this group, which unfortunately tends to be defined by what you're against and who you're against, right? But I think the ways that money, wealth, greed, comfort have sort of crept into, and just not having this experience of real deep marginalization and persecution that a lot of Christians around the world do.
Yeah.
Sure.
And even in our own country, when you think of Black Christians, right? That teaches you, disciples you, if you will, into a certain way of thinking about religion that is pretty far afield from the Christ who came and, didn't have a place to be born and had to be born in a manger, right?
Yeah. But you list all those things, and that would be if you would ask a congregation, what are you uncomfortable hearing sermons about? What are you uncomfortable discussing on Wednesday nights? We have money, we have race. We could add all those things together, and we're in trouble. Yeah. We're in deep, deep, deep trouble. And all of a sudden it feels jarring to folks, be like, that woman that came back to me, why are we just now talking about this? But anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're kind of getting there, but sort of looking ahead, if you could help it, like just cast the vision of like the church, Big C church, American church, including predominantly white churches. Like, what do you see or hope for kind of in this ongoing struggle for racial justice, of the role that the big church can play, in this ongoing work?
So if you've sort of read between the lines here, for me, the big issue with racism isn't primarily the ideology of treating people differently because of their skin color. I mean, certainly that's part of it. But it's really about the material aspects and the way this works out in terms of the quality of life. So again, going back to Emerson and Smith's Divided by Faith, they talk about different phases of racism. And one of the things that I say in Color of Compromise is racism never goes away, it adapts. So you have race-based chattel slavery, right? Then you move to Jim Crow segregation. And then now Emerson and Smith talk about we live in a racialized society, which means these overt forms of racial segregation and prejudice aren't as accepted anymore. You could argue they're coming back, but what the real pernicious aspects of racism look like today are any major quality of life factor you can name still falls predictably along racial lines. So whether that's life expectancy, educational attainment, wealth, all of that falls along racial lines, right? And you shouldn't be able to predict someone's average lifespan because of their skin color, right? So that's what remains. That's where the church has to think creatively and intervene. And so this is where the arc of racial justice comes in. It's no one thing, right? It's not all awareness. It's not all just, reading the books, having the book study or the Bible study. That's part of it. We got to know what we're dealing with. Nor is it all relational, which white Christians love. Well, let's get together. Let's do the pulpit swap. Let's have the coffee. Let's, have the conversation and the friendship and whatever. That's good too. I'm not saying, all of a sudden be mean. Stop trying to be nice to folks or kind to folks. But that's necessary, but not sufficient. You also have to have commitment, by which I mean not just staying the course, but committing to changing these systems and these policies and these infrastructures. So making a plan at a congregational level or even a denominational level that says, what are we going to do for the next 3 months, 3 years to raise awareness strategically, right? Books we're going to read, movies we're going to watch, discussions we're going to have, guests we're going to invite. What are we going to do strategically to build relationships of solidarity? Individual, yes, particularly for white people, because historically, white folks have done a great job putting up walls between them and everyone else. So now you're going to have to be even better at building bridges, right? But not just individually, with communities. So the sociology tells us what really changes the mind of a white person is not that one relationship or that one Black best friend. It's having a chorus of voices who are different and see the world differently. And then you're like, oh, well, maybe I need to rethink what my community has told me. And then lastly, what are you going to commit to? Whether that's, trying to pull levers around mass incarceration, around voting rights. A real big one is reparations, which I say in The Color of Compromise, or maybe it's How to Fight Racism. I say the only other R word scarier than racism is reparations for white people, because that has to do with the redistribution of wealth. And there's just been this politicization of, government handouts or welfare, being all this evil and nefarious thing. But if you just look at the history, because what was race-based chattel slavery? It was labor exploitation. So for 2 centuries, Black people literally built the wealth of this nation through their blood, sweat, and tears, and we were not paid. And it didn't happen after emancipation, and it didn't happen at the dawn of the 20th century, and it hasn't happened since. And then when you get down to it, whether it's health or education or housing or wealth, so much of that can be traced to being emancipated from physical chains, but then shackled to the chains of poverty.
Of like the reparations of like, what does true equity look like? There's generations of inequality, not just inequality, but that piece.
And can I just get real practical? Like,
Please.
We have a lot of wealthy churches who, when you really analyze, especially if they're older churches, when you analyze how they gain that wealth, it's probably because it was hoarded and kept from others, whether that's through exclusive housing in neighborhoods where you could continually increase property values and appreciate and value, and whether you hand that down to your children or sell it for a profit, or you have better schools which lead to better jobs, whether it's through literal slave labor, if you go back far enough to some of these historic churches, right? And regardless of how they got the money, what do we owe each other? There's so many pastors of, in particular, Black congregations that they're not full-time. They're bi or tri-vocational, right? What does it look like to pay a full-time salary so somebody can devote themselves to the work and the life of the church, right? Or pay off the mortgage, right? Or churches are coming together to pay off medical bills for people. Or even just as simple as, I talked about the Witness before. We're a nonprofit, and we don't have the same, Black people in general, Black Christians in particular, don't have the same networks of resources, right? People you can go to and say, hey, we need $10,000 to pull off this conference, or will you be a sponsor? Whatever like that. supporting the entities that are already doing the work and having the humility to say, we don't have to create the solution. We can come alongside those who are already doing it.
Yeah. That is such a good, challenging, and convicting word for us, Dr. Tisby, because it's a one thing to say we support, we affirm, we have coffee with, we pulpit swap, but it's another thing to say, no, we're actually in this and we want to see sustainable change going forward. And that does mean something financially. Here goes with the things we're not comfortable talking about, right?
Right.
Because it costs us something, and it should, right, to engage in that. I think there's so much when I engage in conversations in Louisville, whether it's with Empower West or with other Black pastors, there's this big distrust between a Black congregation and white congregations, because there has been so much of we take a picture, we have coffee, we use this for our social media accounts, and we move on, but we didn't actually do any kind of thing. We maybe relation built for about 2 minutes and that's it, right? But I love what you're pointing us towards. And it also makes it so we can't get excuse that it's this huge systemic problem. We can't do anything about it. Well, no, you can.
That's good.
You can.
That's right.
Okay, very practical, steps. I really appreciate that. And what the word that I was hearing as you were speaking is partnership.
Yep.
Right. And that's pretty biblical. That's in the gospel, in this idea. And especially, I think, among white churches, in my experience of growing up in this denominational, even in a large church like Louisville, here comes the individual piece again. We tend to operate like we're our own, and we're competitive against one another. And it's all about our own kind of success, usually according to, wealth and butts and seats. And this idea of even working together, is like, oh, I don't know, but whose member would they be, but you're calling us to think even, you said creatively, even farther beyond of like, what would it look like to pay a full-time salary for a Black pastor in a predominantly Black church that could, a livable wage that he or she doesn't have to work three jobs to have.
Yep. And not in a paternalistic way, which is back to your word, partnership. Right? That implies an equality to it, and not I'm paying the bills, so you're going to do what I say, which is unfortunately, like I could tell you appalling stories that if they put it in a movie, you'd be like, this is too heavy-handed. This is way too, but literally this church planting situations where, okay, you go in the inner city, you plant this church, but we're paying the bills, so you're going to do it our way. Even though it's a totally different population, and these are grown folks who have the Spirit of God and should be able to make decisions anyway. But that spirit also is part of it. So that's where that relational aspect tends to come in, is that I see you as a human being, as a full human being, and it makes it harder then to have this paternalistic view of, I have the money, so I know best. So here you go.
Wow. Yeah. Well, you've offered us so much practical advice. I really appreciate it. Is there any maybe last word of people like Rob and I, like white pastors in predominantly white churches, of how we can be supporting maybe a specific question of like our Black colleagues or people of color kind of in our system, in our denomination?
So it really helps for white folks to minister to other white folks when it comes to racism. You save me a lot of time and stress. I was listening to another podcast recently, and it's with actors and directors and quote unquote storytellers, right? And they were making the point that art can really move people and shift opinions, especially when it does it in a more oblique way. So it's not directly saying we're addressing racism, but it's telling stories or giving examples. And I wonder what that would look like in the life of a church, where we are promoting the very biblical idea that all people are made in God's image, but moving beyond the sort of generalities of that when it comes to race, if all people are made in God's image, what does that mean? And I think approaching it in a sort of sideways manner to not beat people over the heads with it and thus arouse a direct defense and, stiff arming of that content. So that would look like, to me, structurally, number one, this is on the website. If I, as a Black person, cannot find on your church website some statement that you have around racial justice, I'm already a little concerned. Because if it doesn't warrant a place on the webpage, what place will it have in the life of the congregation, right? Number two, when there's a new members class, right? Typically it's the sort of same curriculum, if you will. Is this incorporated into it from the beginning such that you can say to people, we would love for you to be an official member of this congregation. But before you do that, we want you to know what we believe and where we stand on issues of racial justice. If that's not for you, God bless you. If it is, come on in. Another way to do that is not just sort of the sermon series on race or during Black History Month or MLK Day or whatever. Do those, that's fine. But also, is this part of the regular diet of teaching such that it's not special to bring it up, to bring in, and you don't have to make a big thing of it, right? Quoting Howard Thurman, Black mystic and theologian, right? Giving historical examples for your illustrations that incorporate different people, right? Talking about Fannie Lou Hamer or Ida B. Wells and what they experienced in their life, whether the big things or the mundane things, right? In your pastor's study or your library, you know, somebody walks in and they see this incredible array of people who are influencing your thinking, and not just white, Western, mostly male, dead theologians, right? All of those things make it part of who you are and make it part of your disposition, and start to massage and incorporate these ideas of racial justice into the congregation just through what you're already doing, right? So I would think about those kinds of things, how you can make this less of an event, less of an occasion, less of a season, and more of an entire disposition and attitude.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I like the word you said, diet, just the steady diet of what you are, feeding the people, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Well, our formation has to be, if we're going to expect this of our own congregations, our formation has to be what's setting that up, right? Because that'll naturally, hopefully, come through us in the ways that we preach it. So it doesn't feel like,
100%.
I check this off.
You've got to embody it. Yeah. The more I do this racial justice work, I say this again and again, it's less about the change we see out there in the world, or at least as much about that as it is about the change in ourselves, about who we are becoming. And the more that congregational and faith leaders can embody this idea of the beloved community, the more they can influence the people who they're teaching and discipling. And the more it comes as a natural overflow and not this sort of add-on, like you do Christmas decorations for a little while and then take them down. No, this is actually just our lighting, our everyday lighting when we turn on the switch and need to see. This is what's always here.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, we so appreciate the time that you've given us, Dr. Tisby. This has been so good for my own soul, and I know it's going to be so good for our colleagues' souls and other people that we have the privilege of entering into your homes or workout spaces or going for a walk. We're glad you're here with us. Every episode we have done this kind of part called the Holy Roast.
Yeah, I was wondering about the title. Okay, here we go.
Here we go. And the Holy Roast is kind of this leaders in the hot seat. And so we're going to ask you a series of questions.
Rock and roll.
Rapid fire.
I don't think I have enough caffeine for this, but okay.
Rapid fire questions.
That's so good. So we're going to ask you, and the first thing that comes to your mind, throw it out there for us. You can elaborate or not if there's a good story, right, that comes with it. But so here they are. So what are you reading right now? This could be professional or personal.
I don't read heavy stuff because if I read, it's a rare moment I get. So the book, is it Sniper or Shooter? But it's this. Most people wouldn't like it. It's these thrillers, right? I shouldn't like it. But I'm reading it, and it's actually, this particular author it takes place in Arkansas, where I used to live, and has a very acute sense of the racial dynamics, even though he's a white author. I'm fascinated about how he's using dialogue, like insider dialogue, both black and white, and the words they would use and the language they would use. I'm like, that's pretty darn accurate.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
That's awesome. We'll have to look that one up.
I'll have to look it up because I can't even remember the
Sounds
title
stressful.
exactly.
What's keeping you alive right now?
Oh wow, hot baths.
Nice.
Dude, listen, I am self-care all day, right?
Yes.
Both the cheap and the less cheap forms of it. But literally just we have one of those tubs where the water can actually go up kind of to your shoulders kind of a thing. Man, if I'm stressed, if I'm sore, if I can't get to sleep, hot bath.
Hot bath.
Yeah. With some bath salts.
Yeah.
Per se.
Okay, all
You
right.
know.
Oh, yeah.
I
There
ain't
you
ashamed.
go.
Look, man, go on and do it. Get some oil on your skin. Make sure that it stays supple and take care of yourself.
Amen.
I
Yeah.
love that.
Take
I
care
love
of
that.
yourself.
What are 5 things on your nightstand?
5 things are a lamp. Oh, my Bluetooth speaker, because I always sleep with like sounds or something.
Okay.
Phone and watch charger, chapstick, and saline drops for your nose.
Okay.
There you
There
go.
you go.
Gets dry.
That's right. What's your favorite way to unwind after a long day?
Well, I already mentioned hot bath, so let me
right.
think of something else. Unwind after a long day. I mean, there's stuff I just try to do, like walks, for sure. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. Like what we watch on TV.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, let me try to think of something that's okay for a bunch of clergy.
They're probably watching trash on Netflix too. So
we're
it's
probably
okay.
right there with you.
Well, funny enough, because my son just got into the series Bones.
Okay.
So we watched those together. He just likes to see the body at the beginning, like it's in its state of, however they find it. It'll always some new scenario. And then I like the characters behind it.
Okay,
Good
my
casting.
husband has watched that one. Yeah. Yeah.
That was not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
No, that could have been
I
so
had
much
a worse
worse.
one, but I
I was like, I've been watching Love is Blind. What are you talking about?
well, Reacher is the other series I've been
Reacher.
watching. I read the whole series. There's like 27 books. I've read them all.
Nice. That's awesome.
Nice.
So I can get as trashy as you want. But yeah, I tried to keep it light.
That could be our after conversation here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So last question. You're called up to bat and you're about to get and hit that ball. What's your walk-up song to the plate?
Oh my. Well, this is not safe for church, right? But Victory by Diddy and Notorious B.I.G.
There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, you got to look that one up. But it's a hype song.
Love it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again. This has been an honor, privilege to host you on this. And I do hope that you will check out, we will link in the comments and all those sections, all of his books and podcasts and everything else that keeps him so busy.
And my Substack, like that's the way where you can keep up with my latest writing and thinking, jemartisby.substack.com. You can subscribe for free, or you can become a paid subscriber and help support my work of historical truth-telling and racial justice.
Yeah.
Go. That's so good. Well, thank you so much for doing
you.
this.
Thank you for being here.